There's a type of man who never chases. He doesn't beg, he doesn't plead, he doesn't try to convince you to stay. And at first, you mistake it for indifference. You think if he really cared, wouldn't he fight for me? But you're wrong, because this kind of man isn't passive, he's powerful. He doesn't chase because he knows his value. He doesn't need to be chosen to feel whole. And when you walk away, he lets you. Not because he stopped caring, but because he refuses to lose himself trying to keep someone else. He's the man you don't notice at first. He's quiet, composed. He doesn't compete for attention. He watches. He listens. He chooses his words carefully. And when he enters your life, he doesn't fill it with fireworks. He stabilizes it. He doesn't flood you with affection, but you feel safe around him. And because he's not dramatic, you assume he's easy to leave. But what you don't realize is he's not trying to win you. He's trying to see if you recognize something real. If you don't, he won't correct you. He'll let silence speak for him. You'll feel his absence differently. Not like a storm, but like the air leaving the room, like the steady rhythm that disappears, and suddenly everything feels louder, messier, harder to breathe in. He won't block you, won't call you, won't try to haunt you. He'll just vanish with elegance. And that's what makes him unforgettable. Because you expected noise, but got distance. You expected emotion, but got peace. And the quiet way he exits echoes louder than anything you've ever heard from men who chased. He doesn't punish you when you pull away. He doesn't guilt you into staying. He respects your choices, even when they hurt him. Because he knows what's forced can't last. He doesn't want to be loved out of pressure. He wants to be chosen from clarity. And if you're not ready, if you're unsure, he'll give you space not to manipulate. But because he honors his energy, and that kind of dignity, it doesn't come from apathy. It comes from mastery of self. Of knowing that losing someone else should never mean losing yourself. At the time, his stillness feels infuriating. You're used to men who protest, who chase, who drown in your absence. But he doesn't. He stays where he is, unmoved, and it makes you wonder, did he even care? You don't understand yet that his care was never loud. It was in how he showed up, not in how he begged. It was in his consistency, not in his chaos. And by the time you realize that, he's gone, not out of spite, but because he knows his peace is more sacred than proving his worth to someone unsure about theirs. You'll try to test him like you've tested others before. You'll pull back to see if he'll follow. You'll get cold to see if he warms up, but he won't. Not out of pride, but out of principle. He's not interested in playing emotional hide and seek. If you need space, he'll respect it, but he won't chase to soothe your doubts. He believes love should be mutual, not manipulated. And when your silence drags on, he doesn't panic. He simply takes it as an answer and disappears with the kind of grace that stings days later. He's the kind of man who doesn't argue for his place in your life. He never has to say, "You'll regret losing me." He knows time will do that for him. Because when a man like this walks away, he leaves behind a silence that's not empty but reflective. The kind of silence that forces you to confront what you overlooked. You'll find yourself scrolling through old messages, remembering how calm he made you feel, and suddenly you'll realize he wasn't boring, he was rare. And now he's gone. You'll hear his voice in the way other men fail to speak, in how quickly they react, in how easily they break under pressure. He never did. He didn't flinch when you were moody. He didn't shrink when you got loud. He remained until you left. And now, every emotionally unstable man you meet will highlight what he quietly carried: stability, controlled depth. You didn't have the language to name it before, but now that it's missing, your whole body remembers. Not with drama, but with quiet ache. His presence was so peaceful you mistook it for ordinary. You thought, he's just calm. But now, in rooms filled with noise, you miss the way he made the air feel safe. He never filled the space with words. But when he was there, you felt grounded. And that's the thing about men like him. They don't create intensity. They create clarity. And when that clarity is gone, you start confusing chaos with connection again. Until one day, you realize you left the one man who didn't need to chase you to love you right. You'll tell yourself he was too distant, that he didn't fight hard enough, that he should have done more to make you stay. But deep down, you know he did everything except abandon himself. And that's what unsettled you most. He was unmoved by emotional games. He didn't flinch when you withdrew affection. He loved you, but never at the cost of self-betrayal. And that's why you remember him. Because in a world of men willing to lose themselves for attention, he was the one man who wouldn't lose himself for you. He never needed to be loud to be heard. His boundaries were clear without ever being spoken. You knew what he tolerated, what he didn't. And not because he corrected you, but because he never participated in disrespect. If you crossed the line, he didn't explode, he exited, quietly, permanently. And it's only after losing him that you understand. The most powerful men don't enforce their worth through dominance. They enforce it through absence. When it's gone, you don't just notice, you feel the gap in your bones. You'll wonder how he could detach so cleanly. How someone so present, so real, could disappear without noise. But that's what men of discipline do. They don't collapse when someone leaves, they hold their shape. His absence won't be filled by new texts or closure talks. He won't reach out just to check in. And that's what makes it unbearable, because closure with him isn't a conversation. It's silence that doesn't return your echo, the kind that teaches you what you should have held onto while it was still standing in front of you. At first, you might try to replace him. Someone louder, more reactive, more romantic. But it won't work, because no one else moves like him. No one else sits in stillness without trying to fix you. No one else listens without turning the moment into their own. With him, love wasn't performance, it was presence. It was steadiness. And as you grow, you'll realize most men respond to your fire with more fire. He responded with breath, with silence, with depth. And that contrast will haunt you in the quiet moments between new faces. You didn't know it then, but you were testing him. With your distance, with your mood swings, with your game. You wanted to see if he'd chase, if he'd break pattern like the others. But he didn't. He stayed composed, centered, still. And you mistook that for not caring. But now you know it was the opposite. He cared enough not to abandon who he was for who you needed him to temporarily become. And when a man chooses integrity over impulse, you may walk away. But you'll never forget that he didn't follow. He was the kind of man who didn't argue when misunderstood, who didn't over-explain when accused, who didn't beg when misjudged. He let your perception stand because he knew truth needs no defense, and that calmness used to frustrate you. You wanted passion, drama, reassurance. But what he offered was deeper respect, not for your emotions, but for his own essence. And now that you've felt the difference, every man who tries to prove himself feels like noise, because the one who never tried proved the most. The day you realize he's really gone isn't loud. There's no dramatic goodbye, no door slammed shut. It hits you on a quiet morning, maybe while folding laundry or staring at your phone with no unread messages. That's when you feel it, the absence of his energy, not just his voice, but the way your thoughts used to soften around him. You didn't have to earn his presence. He gave it freely, steadily, until you pulled away one too many times. And now that it's gone, you realize it wasn't passivity, it was peace. With him, you never questioned where you stood until you pushed too far. He never needed control to feel powerful. He gave you room to think, to feel, to come back if you chose to. But when you used that space to test his patience, he didn't chase, he just stopped showing up. Not with resentment, with resolve, because his love wasn't desperate, it was clean. And when you crossed the threshold of self-respect, he didn't slam the door. He just removed himself from the room, like a man who knows silence can speak more than anger ever could. You'll remember the way he made hard things feel manageable. How one look from him could settle the chaos in your chest. He didn't offer solutions. He didn't give motivational speeches. He was just there, solid. And now, surrounded by men who overpromise and under-deliver, you'll miss that stillness, that certainty, the kind that doesn't scream "I love you," but says it in every unshaken breath. And when you realize that kind of steadiness can't be replicated, you'll stop searching. Because deep down, you know you let go of something unrepeatable. Others will try to love you louder. They'll flood your phone, your inbox, your weekends. They'll write poems and plan surprises. But none of it will hit the way his silence did. Because what he gave you wasn't noise, it was nervous system relief, a love that didn't demand performance, a presence that didn't disappear when you weren't easy to love. He never made you feel small to feel strong. And when that kind of love leaves, you don't crave intensity. You crave restoration. But men like him don't return. They're not cycles, they're seasons. You won't find closure with him. Not because he ghosted you, but because he gave you nothing to resent. He was kind. He was clear. He didn't retaliate. And that's what makes it harder. There's no drama to distract from the truth. You lost him by thinking he'd wait. But men like him don't orbit forever. They offer you a place to land, and if you keep flying past it, they don't chase the plane. They go home. Back to their peace. And eventually, you realize you didn't just lose a relationship. You lost a mirror. One that showed you what you weren't ready to hold. You'll find yourself explaining him to people who never met him. He wasn't like the others, you'll say. He didn't chase, but he was always there, until he wasn't. And as you describe him, your voice will soften, not with regret alone, but with reverence. Because men like him leave differently. They don't leave you shattered, they leave you aware. Aware of how rare emotional maturity is. Aware of how badly you wanted chaos before you ever understood calm. And suddenly, no one else feels like enough. You'll revisit the last few conversations looking for signs. Was he pulling away? Was there something I missed? But that's the thing, he didn't pull away. He pushed, slowly, subtly. With every test, every silence, every expectation that he'd do what all the others did chase. But he didn't. He stayed until staying no longer aligned with his self-respect. And when that moment came, he didn't lecture you about your mistakes. He just made a quiet decision, one that now lives loudly in your memory. With time, you'll begin to notice what he taught you without teaching. You'll start holding your own emotions instead of weaponizing them. You'll stop expecting people to prove their love through panic. You'll speak slower, breathe deeper, choose silence over shouting. And one day, someone will say, "You've changed," and you'll know why. Because the man who never chased you didn't leave empty-handed. He left an imprint on your pace, on your posture, on your standard. And that imprint becomes your compass. You'll scroll past familiar behaviors, emotional manipulation, performative affection, volatility disguised as passion, and you won't engage. Not because you're bitter, but because you've seen the real thing. You've been in the presence of someone who didn't need chaos to feel close, who didn't demand your energy to validate his own. He gave space, he gave silence, he gave sovereignty, and that recalibrates you. You no longer crave what's dramatic, you crave what's dignified. Because once you've had peace, noise feels violent. One day you'll stop waiting for him to come back, not because you've stopped caring, but because you've grown into the version of yourself he always saw beneath the surface. The one who doesn't need to be chased to feel worthy. The one who doesn't mistake attention for affection. And in that quiet evolution, you'll understand why he never fought to keep you. He wasn't walking away from you, he was walking toward himself. And now, finally, so are you. That's the gift of the man who never chased, but never truly left. At some point, someone will try to love you loudly again. They'll say all the words you used to crave. They'll show up with grand gestures, chase you when you run, argue passionately when you test them. And for a brief moment, it might feel flattering, familiar. But deep down, your nervous system will flinch. Because now you know love isn't supposed to feel like chasing or chasing back. It's supposed to feel like alignment. Like someone who doesn't pursue you to calm their insecurity, but stands still and lets truth lead. You'll remember how he never raised his voice. How even in conflict, he never made you feel small. He didn't try to dominate the room. He didn't try to outspeak you. He waited. He listened. And in that listening, you felt something rare dignity. He didn't need to control you to feel powerful. He only needed to remain himself. That kind of restraint, that depth, it stays with you. Not because it was flashy, but because it was honest. And now, every reactive man will feel like static compared to the quiet clarity he carried. There was no performance with him, no mask, no persona crafted to win you over. He didn't sell himself to you. He offered himself, fully, calmly, without pressure. And when you weren't ready to receive it, he didn't try to make himself smaller. He didn't try to negotiate his worth. He simply stepped back. Not to punish you, but to protect his peace. That choice was his boundary. And now you understand boundaries not as walls, but as standards. the line where self-respect ends and self-sacrifice begins. He never crossed it, and now neither do you. You might wonder if he ever thinks about you, if he misses you the way you miss him, but you won't reach out, not because you don't care, but because you now understand the kind of man he is. He doesn't circle back to half clarity. He doesn't reopen doors closed by truth. And honestly, you respect that, because he taught you the difference between a man who can't let go and one who knows when to. One clings out of fear. The other walks away from anything that asks him to abandon his center. You asked. He chose differently. You used to crave chaos because it made you feel something. But he showed you that peace can feel even deeper when it's earned. That connection doesn't have to be noisy to be real. And now, that lesson lives in you. In the way you hold your silence without apology. In the way you no longer try to prove your worth through emotional reaction. He left you, yes, but he left you stronger. Not because he stayed and fixed you, but because he walked away cleanly, and in doing so, showed you how to finally stop running from yourself. One day, someone will ask, "Why didn't you fight for him?" And you'll hesitate because there's no simple answer. You didn't know how to fight for stillness. You didn't recognize peace when it stood in front of you. You were looking for something louder, more familiar, more dramatic. And by the time you realized the power of what he offered, it was too late. He was never going to beg to be understood. He was never going to compete with your confusion. He gave you a chance to choose him in clarity. And when you didn't, he chose to leave quietly. He didn't leave to teach you a lesson. He didn't disappear as revenge. He left because the version of you that needed testing, games, and emotional validation wasn't aligned with who he was. And now, years later, you understand. Because you've outgrown those games too. You've become the woman who now sees how rare his stillness was, how loving his detachment really felt, how intentional his silence was. He didn't react because he didn't need to. And that level of emotional discipline, it's not something you forget. It rewires what you're willing to accept. You'll catch yourself doing what he used to do, pausing before you speak, breathing instead of reacting, holding your center when everything around you tries to pull you out of alignment. And that's when it hits you. He didn't change you with words. He changed you by example. He didn't lead you, he invited you. And now you lead yourself the same way, not by overpowering others, but by embodying that rare energy he once brought into your life. You're no longer chasing men. You're becoming the kind you used to lose. Others will tell you to move on, to forget him, to stop holding him in such high regard. But what they don't understand is, he's not a fantasy you're clinging to. He's a frequency you're calibrated to now. After him, you can't unsee what steadiness feels like. You can't pretend inconsistency feels like passion. You can't convince yourself that chasing is connection. He didn't raise your standards with effort. He did it with presence. And now you're not looking for closure. You're looking for alignment, and very few can meet you there. Even if you never speak again, his impact is permanent. Not because he hurt you, but because he held a mirror to your emotional immaturity and walked away before it poisoned the connection. That kind of departure doesn't leave you bitter. It leaves you awake. You don't grieve the loss like a breakup. You grieve the version of yourself that couldn't see him clearly when it mattered. And that grief is sacred, because from it, something stronger is born, a woman who no longer begs to be chased, but chooses to stand still with someone who never had to. Sometimes the ache doesn't come from what happened, but from what didn't. There was no grand finale, no final argument, no emotional explosion. Distance, space, a quiet understanding that he would not run after you, that you would have to meet him in stillness or not at all. And that's the kind of ending that lingers, because it wasn't fueled by hate, it was held by grace. And grace leaves behind a bruise you can't see, but feel every time someone new enters your life and doesn't measure up to the silence he left behind. There's a loneliness that follows when you realize what you once called boring was actually peace, when you thought his lack of chasing meant lack of care. But it wasn't care he lacked, it was chaos. He refused to love you through adrenaline. He loved you through presence, through boundaries, through self-respect. And now, every emotionally intense connection feels exhausting, Because you've had the rare experience of someone who didn't perform love, he practiced it. And love practiced quietly is louder in its absence than chaos ever was in its presence. People talk about unforgettable lovers like they were the wild ones who fought pride, broke things, made declarations. But he wasn't any of that. He was still, solid. He didn't try to leave a mark, he just left truth. And truth lingers in places drama can't touch. It sits quietly in the background of your thoughts, showing up every time someone makes you question your worth again. Because he never did. He never made you beg. He simply made you choose. And when you didn't, he didn't punish you, he just disappeared with dignity. You'll think about reaching out, not to rekindle, but to say thank you for not bending to win you, for not matching your chaos, for loving you through stability and leaving when you couldn't see it. But you won't, because part of his gift was teaching you the power of silence, the strength in non-response. He taught you that real love doesn't plead, it waits. And if it's not met, it leaves quietly. That lesson became your spine. And now you carry him not in conversation, but in how you choose yourself. Eventually, someone will ask what made him different, and you'll pause because it's not a simple answer. It wasn't what he did. It was what he didn't do. He didn't chase. He didn't cling. He didn't collapse. He held his shape when you lost yours. And that kind of restraint is something most people won't understand. Because we've romanticized reactivity, not responsibility. But you'll smile softly and say he never needed to prove himself. That's how I knew he was the real thing. And deep down, a part of you always will. There's a maturity in his absence that still humbles you. He didn't block you, didn't check in, didn't leave a window cracked for maybe someday. He closed the chapter fully, without spite, without drama. And that, more than anything, taught you what self-respect looks like in action. He didn't need closure because he was already complete. He didn't chase you because he didn't need to convince you. He let you walk, not as punishment but as proof. Proof that his love wasn't about control, it was about choice. And you chose. Now you live with it. The hardest part wasn't losing him, it was realizing he was the first man you ever had to meet in your own power. He wouldn't meet you in your wounds, he'd wait in your clarity. And when you couldn't reach it, he didn't lower his standards, he stepped back. He didn't love your potential, he honored your present. And when your present couldn't hold him, he walked. Not away from you, but toward his peace. That's what hurt most, not the leaving, but knowing he had the strength to love you, and still leave anyway. You've dated since, you've laughed, you've even felt sparks, but there's a difference between chemistry and conviction. And no one else has had that same quiet conviction he carried. That same ability to hold space without swallowing you whole. They love loudly, but without structure. They show up big, but fall apart fast. And every time one of them falters, you remember his steadiness. The way his love didn't need to be proven every day, because it was built on something deeper than desire. It was built on discipline. There was something timeless about him. Not in how he dressed or spoke, but in how he moved through life. He didn't rush. He didn't scramble. He had nothing to prove and everything to protect, his peace, his purpose, his values. And he never let love shake that. That's what set him apart. Most men lose themselves in the pursuit of connection. He stayed himself, even while loving you. And now you measure every man against that standard. Not how much noise he makes, but how much of himself he keeps when things get quiet. You'll always feel a quiet respect for him. Not because he loved you perfectly, but because he loved you purely, without ego, without manipulation, without asking you to become smaller so he could feel bigger. He didn't chase you because he didn't need to overpower you to feel chosen. And when you left, he didn't punish you. He just honored your decision and disappeared with grace. That kind of man doesn't need to be remembered. He becomes a reference point. And from now on, every choice you make will trace back to him. There's a version of you now that he would recognize, not because you've become softer, but because you've become steadier. You no longer react to silence with panic. You no longer test love just to feel secure. You've stopped asking, will he chase me? And started asking, will he match my peace? And that shift, that quiet, internal transformation was shaped by his absence. Because sometimes it's not the man who stays that changes you most. It's the one who walked away without making you feel abandoned. One day, someone will ask, if he was so good, why did you let him go? And you'll pause, not out of shame, but reflection. You'll say, because I didn't know how to receive what I wasn't ready to become. He didn't leave because he stopped loving you. He left because you were still learning how to love without conditions, without tests, without fear. And now, real love doesn't demand reassurance, it offers stillness. And if you can't meet that stillness with your own, you lose it. Not because he left, but because you didn't stay. You'll never see his love story on a screen. It doesn't make for good cinema. No screaming, no dramatic kisses in the rain, just presence, boundaries, silence when it matters. His kind of love doesn't look like romance, it looks like responsibility. And that's why it's rare, because it doesn't feed your ego, it feeds your soul. And while it may not feel electric in the beginning, it's the only love that lasts when the lights go out. The kind you can build a life on, the kind that teaches you to stand, even when you're shaking. You'll stop measuring love by intensity, by how badly someone wants you, by how loudly they show it. Instead, you'll start asking, do they stay calm when I'm not? Do they keep their word when no one's watching? Do they respect themselves enough to walk away when I don't? And those questions, those quiet standards, are the ones he left behind. He didn't chase because he didn't need your chaos to validate his care. He needed your clarity. And when it never came, he gave you the greatest gift, a standard you could grow into. If you ever see him again, it won't be dramatic. There will be no speech, no begging, no what if. He'll smile. And in that moment, you'll both know. He didn't leave you to hurt you. He left because he loved you enough not to stay where love had to be proven, not lived. And maybe, just maybe, you'll thank him. Not out loud, but in the way you love now. In the way you hold yourself. In the way you no longer chase, because you finally understand the ones worth having don't run, and the ones worth keeping never have to be chased. You'll think of him in moments of stillness, not in longing but in recognition. When you sit in silence and feel completely whole, you'll remember how he used to do that without effort, how he could sit across from you, say nothing, and still make you feel seen. He never needed to fill space to prove he was present. And now you're learning to do the same, not just with others, but with yourself. That's his echo, not in your memories, but in your mastery of emotion, of presence, of knowing that the loudest love often moves in silence. You may never tell him how much he changed you, but the change is visible in how you stop engaging with people who demand proof of love through pain, in how you walk away faster from chaos disguised as passion, in how you no longer ask, why isn't he chasing me? Because now you know chasing is what people do when they haven't learned how to stand still. He taught you that, not through words but through example. And now your presence has weight, because he showed you how to carry it. Others may call him detached, cold, emotionless. But you know better. You saw the care behind his restraint, the patience behind his silence, the depth behind his boundaries. He didn't react because he wasn't afraid. He didn't chase because he wasn't confused. And you used to think love had to hurt a little to feel real, but he showed you that real love feels safe. Not exciting, not erratic, just steady. That steadiness stays with you, not like fire, like ground. And now, you only build with people who carry the same strength. There's a quiet grief in losing a man like him, not because he broke you, but because he didn't. He left you intact, respected, seen, and somehow that makes it harder. Because you can't hate him, you can't blame him, you can only grow from him. And that's the legacy of a man who doesn't chase, he doesn't create trauma. He creates transformation, not by fixing you, but by being unshakable while you fix yourself. And when the work is done, he's not there, but everything about how you love is different now. That's his mark. You'll find yourself becoming him in moments you least expect. When someone tests your peace and you choose stillness. When someone pulls away and you don't chase. When someone accuses and you don't defend, you just breathe. That's when you'll know his presence didn't leave, it became yours. And now, you're not just remembering him, you're embodying him. You are no longer the woman who needed to be pursued. You are the woman who holds her ground. And maybe, without knowing it, that's what he was waiting for all along. Eventually, you'll stop seeing him as the one who got away, and start seeing him as the one who woke you up. You won't replay the past with regret, but with reverence. Because without his stillness, you wouldn't have found your own. Without his silence, you wouldn't have learned to listen to yourself. He didn't come into your life to complete you. He came to remind you that you were never meant to chase what's already within. And now, that inner calm, that clarity, it's yours. Because he didn't give it to you, he showed you the way to it. His memory won't fade like the others, not because he stayed longer or loved harder, but because he left cleaner, without damage, without confusion. And that kind of exit, it doesn't leave wounds, it leaves wisdom. You carry him in how you breathe, in how you don't explain your worth anymore, in how you no longer panic when love feels calm. He didn't make you softer, he made you clearer. And that's the kind of love that lasts, not in your bed, but in your backbone, not in your inbox, but in your integrity. Sometimes the lesson isn't in what a man says to you, it's in what he refuses to say. He didn't beg, he didn't plead, he didn't list all the reasons you were losing something sacred. He let you discover it on your own, and that's why it mattered. He knew that the loudest wake-up calls come after the silence, not to punish you, but to elevate you. And when that realization finally hit, it didn't break you, it built you into the kind of woman who never again confuses attention with affection, noise with presence, or chasing with care. You're not waiting for someone to fill the space he left, because no one can. And that's not tragic, it's liberating. It means you finally understand the rarity of alignment. The kind of connection that doesn't rush, doesn't chase, doesn't demand. It just exists in truth. He gave you that without pressure, without performance. And now, you're not looking to replace him, you're looking to honor him. By becoming someone who walks with that same clarity, someone who doesn't run from stillness, but radiates it. In the end, he was never yours to keep. He was yours to awaken, to shake the foundation of what you thought love required. He didn't stay to complete the story, he appeared to rewrite the opening. And now, every chapter you write carries his fingerprints in your calm, in your discernment, in your refusal to chase what doesn't stand still with you. He may be gone from your life, but he's in your standard. And that is how you know the man who never chased you is the one you'll never forget.